Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be for each of you. And welcome to today's Fintelekt and Asian Bankers Association webinar on AML enforcement challenges. As some of you know, my name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintelekt. It is my pleasure to be your host for the webinar today. As always, we have a tremendous response to the webinar in terms of number of registrations. Over 900 people registered for today's webinar across 50 plus countries. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for attending these webinars and actually helping us achieve true democratization of AML CFT education, an ambitious goal that we have set for ourselves, though we have realized over the years that it is a continuously moving target. This month, we also celebrate 3 years of the ABA Fintelekt webinar partnership, via which we have completed 20 webinars for the ABA membership, today's webinar being the 21st. And I would like to thank Ernest, Amador, and Meg from the ABA for working together with us to raise awareness on AML CFT amongst institutions in the Asia Pacific and even beyond, actually. As usual in the webinar today, please post your questions for speakers in the Q&A window. And if you need any assistance, please enter your comments in the chat window, and one of my colleagues will help you out. So, coming to the webinar topic for today, as AML regimes mature and evolve around the world, sector regulators and financial intelligence units are increasingly expecting more from reporting entities or regulated entities, as they're called in different countries. From the standpoint of banks and FIs, with monetary penalties as well as reputation at stake, better AML CFT risk management has actually become unavoidable now. In today's webinar, we will aim to cover both sides of the AML enforcement coin, that is the challenges that regulators face in enforcing the AML regime, as well as challenges that banks and financial institutions face in complying with and meeting regulatory expectations. So we are actually very lucky to have a very, very experienced and relevant set of panelists to achieve this goal today. Three AML CFT experts who have been on the regulatory or law enforcement side earlier in their careers and now serve in different roles, either as compliance heads or professionals or consultants. And we will try and learn from them about the gaps in effectiveness and what can be done better. So again, with that, Steve, Nick, and Avaneesh, welcome to the webinar, and thank you so much for joining us today to share your thoughts.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Shirish. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thanks, Shirish.
Participants,
I'm looking forward to the session.
Thanks, Nick. Participants, let me quickly introduce our panelists in more detail before we start the session. Dr. Stephen Cutler, Steve, as he's known, is the Chief Enterprise Risk and Compliance Officer for OmniPay, a successful non-bank financial institution based in the Philippines, but operating globally. In this role, he addresses a wide range of issues from physical, financial, and cyber aspects of the business, as well as data privacy and AML issues. He also consults with Philippine and international government and private entities on technology and security matters and teaches these topics at the university and in-service levels. He is a level 2 certified data privacy officer. Prior to his work with OmniPay, Steve was a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and his career includes 5 years as head of all FBI operations in the Philippines, and he earned his PhD in criminology. Our second panelist, Nicholas Mctaggart, again a very well-known speaker in the Asia-Pac region, is a former Australian Federal Police agent and former national coordinator of the Australian government's asset confiscation task force. Nick retired from the Australia Federal Police after 38 years to commence his own consultancy business called the Murinbin Group. He is a very experienced subject matter expert on AML, economic crime, and criminal asset confiscation, and was engaged in strategic planning of government approaches to the problems over a number of years. Nick is currently consulting to several private and public sector entities, focusing on risk identification, policy formulation and implementation, and assurance testing relating to financial and other organized criminal activity associated with fraud and scams. He is also working with clients to help identify infiltration by organized crime into legitimate and well-established international supply chains, a phenomenon which is becoming more and more prevalent these days. In the final years of his police career, Nick was the AFP's representative on FATF and APG forums and co-published two typology reports for these organizations, the first on trade-based money laundering and the second on the vulnerability of the gold market to money laundering and terrorist financing. Our third panelist, Avaneesh Raman, again a well-known speaker. Avaneesh is a practitioner in AML CFT with 14 years, over 14 years of extensive and unique experience across the Asia Pac region. He is an AML CFT consultant with the International Governance and Risk Institute called GovRisk, a firm based in London, and has worked extensively in Myanmar and engaged in research projects with Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, that is the FCDO. Previously, he was employed as manager intelligence management with the Fiji Financial Intelligence Unit based at the Reserve Bank of Fiji and delivered various presentations and facilitated workshops in AML and related subject matter. He is qualified as an international FIU law enforcement assessor and expert with the APG and was an expert assessor for the APG 2017-18 mutual evaluation of the Cook Islands. Avnish also represents Fintelekt Academy in Fiji and the Pacific Islands. So with that, panelists, welcome again to the webinar, and let's get straight into the discussion now. So, I think we cannot nowadays start any discussion without mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me start with that. So, the pandemic has actually elevated financial crime risks and brought in a variety of typologies, some new and some older risks that have now intensified. So what would you say have been the top three risks that have emerged over the last couple of years within the region? And have there been any specific measures taken by regulators in your country or immediate geography to deal with these heightened or new risks? Steve, maybe you could start this off.
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. A couple of ideas that come to my mind are one of the risks that we see is the fact that so much more activity is going on over the internet with e-commerce. That adds a real risk to a lot of things because you don't actually see who the person is that you're dealing with. It's easy for identities to be stolen or to be faked and used to defraud or to launder money. I actually think that frauds are probably a bigger issue, even if we're trying to deal with the money laundering. There will be money laundering involved, obviously, in the fraud investigations, and that's something that I want to talk about probably during a later question. But so I see the fact that we're dealing with e-commerce to be a tremendous risk these days, especially for countries such as the Philippines that have begun to go with a KYC light that perhaps requires only one piece of identification to be scanned and sent in. Well, you don't really know who's doing that, but the central bank has decided that they would let that go anyway to try to improve financial inclusion. And they figure that, well, with the amounts of money involved, it isn't that big of a deal. That leads to smurfing and mules, of course, going with relatively small. The transaction amounts for the mules in their money laundering are relatively small, but the costs are next to nil. So they can do it at be very, very cost effective and cost efficient. I also see, though, that one of the problems that I have with COVID, and then I'll let somebody else speak, is that because of the COVID restrictions, a lot of the regulators and regulators being law enforcement as well as the central banks are operating on possibly not even skeleton crews. They're not coming out to visit in person where they can get a better read on who's lying to them and who's trying to hide things. They're asking for data and information. Oh, just submit it, just submit the electronic copies of it. Well, the lack of on-site inspections, I think, is a real threat to the system and to our nations. Maybe not to a business that's doing AML. They'll actually like the fact aren't on-site inspections. But I think that's a real issue that we need to deal with as well. And I'm not quite sure. I can raise the issue, but I don't have an answer to it just yet. So I'll be quiet and let either Avaneesh or Nicholas chime in also.
Thanks, Steve. Avaneesh, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for that question, Shirish, and thank you, Steve, for enlightening a bit about the challenges, the risk in light of the current pandemic. What we have noticed from the Pacific region in particular is the utilization of alternative technology. So we have seen that a lot of individuals have started using alternate technology and other channels to transfer funds, especially in the time of pandemic, because the FIUs around the Pacific have been able to trace EFTRs, but then other payment options such as the telegraphic money orders and PayPal, some of these new or emerging, I would say, payment technology networks have been utilized by individuals to bypass some of the reporting requirements, and some of these channels were deliberately used to avoid detection. Similarly, again, I cannot reiterate that the online scams and payment intercepts has been also a major a risk that has emerged due to the online payment, being one of the challenges that has it has been a challenge, but it has been an enabler, but at the same time it has also brought about enhanced and heightened risk. So cyber criminals have taken advantage of the situations by offering fake loans, packages and relationships to vulnerable sectors of the community and remitted hundreds of thousands of dollars to cyber criminals. There have been suppliers who have been impacted by this. So in terms of what the regulators have done, I would say for the first one, in terms of alternate technology, we know the regulator in Fiji, for example, had signed up a MOU with the postal services so that they could detect some of these telegraphic money orders and PayPal. But otherwise in the region, there has been enhanced dialogue amongst regulators around this, especially on cybercrime and online scams. There has been a lot of advocacy and press releases done by the regulators in the media so that there could be more awareness raised around this. And from a law enforcement perspective, I would say another risk has been the, of course, with the drug shipment being one of the very, enhanced, heightened, I would say, risk in the Pacific. There has been a lot of movement, and the modus operandi in the route, transshipment routes, has obviously led to the law enforcement officials and the regulators being engaging in more open dialogue and being able to exchange intelligence on a more timely basis. So that's my take on that.
Thanks, Avaneesh. Moving to Nick now. Nick, would be great to get your thoughts on this. And for the benefit of those who have joined in a bit late into the webinar, we are discussing, what are the top 3 risks that have emerged over the last couple of years within the region, what are the specific measures that have been taken by regulators to deal with some of these risks. So, Nick, over to you.
Yeah, so Shirish, I think that from my point of view, I talk about the 3 Ds that have increased. The first one being disruption, and we've spoken about that. Steve raised that actually, and I'm sure during this whole presentation we'll be speaking about that. The other one's a level of desperation, and the last one is diversification. So I'll explain the 3 of them. The disruption process fundamentally is that whatever the algorithms that the financial institutions and other organisations were using 2 years ago are probably not going to be of any value today, because the controls that were prevalent then will just not be on the radar anymore, and the crooks have moved on. The desperation process is that fundamentally criminals like these sorts of pandemics and constant change, because it's easier for them to be able to recruit the individuals that they need as middle persons and people that go under the radar. And, like as Steve mentioned, money mules and people like that, there are far more people out there because of the desperation brought about by COVID, where they're prepared to take a risk for these individuals. Organisations, small businesses, exactly the same, where they're prepared to accept loans from the criminal groups to keep their business going, which again allows the criminal groups to hide their money. And conversely, you know, their situation with their desperation is that they will start doing their own stuff and not dealing with it. And the last one is diversification. In Australia, there are millions of examples of a business that was doing a type of business 2 years ago and doing totally different business now. So the exercise is where an institution feels that they may have known their customer a little while ago, they probably don't know the customer at all now for the purposes of what we're talking about. So they're the fundamental exercises. You can see from the work that, you know, the regulator in Australia, AUSTRAC, is doing around trying to get more information out to the regulated entities about what we spoke about, the online scams, the email takeovers. But fundamentally, from my point of view, I think the criminals are moving more and more into manipulating and infiltrating the supply chain. And those individuals that control that side of the fence have no obligation, nor do they have any interest in reporting anything to an FIU. So that's a significant problem we're going to have going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. So I think that's, I like the 3 Ds that you mentioned: disruption, desperation, and diversification. You should come out with a LinkedIn post on that and expand on that so many more people can actually, read it and understand it. So, I think we have spoken a bit about the risks and what regulators are doing. I think we all agree that no matter what happens, there are still a number of gaps, right, in the system. And so, coming to enforcement of AML CFT measures in the economy, whether it's banks or financial institutions, or even in recent years within the wider community, that is the DNFPBs or casinos or such other sectors, where would you say are the gaps in the effectiveness of enforcement? Are monetary penalties really working, or are they just being brushed under the carpet and being viewed as a cost of doing business? Is it just being budgeted for by financial institutions? So, Nick, maybe this time I start with you.
Yeah, look, fundamentally, and I've come out of 38 years of law enforcement. I've seen these cycles go around, but the big thing that COVID's brought about is a total refocus of police resources, a lot to do with the actual management and health of the community. And so, for the last 2 or 3 years, I haven't seen any real focus on any law enforcement body, especially in the Pacific, around still doing what they were doing maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago when I left the organisation. Now, the difficulty you have with that process is that the skill set that gets built up as a consequence of investigations that are undertaken slides. And you start getting a situation now where those people that had those expertise back in the day and now moved on to other things and either have no interest, or alternatively, we've been away from it for so long, those experts have actually moved on and they're retiring and things like that. And so your skill sets in relation to looking after this sort of problem are starting to dissipate. And the other thing that you've got is, because of the restrictions of travel internationally and everywhere else, you've got another problem in that the investigations that need to be undertaken globally just aren't occurring. Because, I can send, if I was the police force in Australia looking for information in the Philippines or in Hong Kong, for instance, they probably put that on the back burner because their priorities are somewhere else. So they're the sorts of issues that we're going to have, and it's not going to improve over the next 2 or 3 years, I don't believe, until we get back to some sense of normality.
All right, Nick. Steve, your thoughts? Steve, you're on mute.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Sorry, I had a hard time hitting the button. A couple of the things that I've got an issue with the enforcement, and actually Nicholas kind of brought this up a couple of minutes ago. We're still doing things, I know in the Philippine context, we're still doing things the same way that it was done when the first AML law was passed in 2000, 2001. And that is that they still have not really done a good job of integrating the AML or the money laundering part of the investigation with the substantive investigation. Theoretically, the police agencies or law enforcement agencies have a desk at the AMLC, and that should help. But in my experience, it doesn't really, because again, from what I've seen, and AMLC in the Philippines, I have a great deal of respect for the executive director, Rosella, as well as all of the guys that I know there that with whom I've worked over the past almost 20 years. That said, I think the system that they're having to work with is less than efficient, and the COVID restrictions have just amplified that and magnified it, and actually also brought it to light where we can actually see how harmful it is. So getting back to where they are, you have kidnapping investigations, drug investigations, and other types of investigations, including corruption investigations. And the law enforcement entities will do those investigations, and they'll get all sorts of records and everything. And then I'd like to think that most of those investigations are spoken to with AMLC, but I'm not real sure. And so AMLC kind of has to conduct a parallel investigation, which acts as a check on the power of each of the entities. I get that, but it also lessens their efficiency, especially in the last 2 or 3 years where we're under heavy restrictions. And so I see that happening a lot. I also see that the other regulators, such as the Banco Central in Filipinas, BSP, that is supposed to make sure that people like my company and the big banks aren't able to get out and actually do a solid, really good audit, investigation, whatever word you want to call it, because they have to do things by Zoom or by Google Meets or whatever. It's just not as effective, and that hampers everybody's work, because I think there are good people out there that want to do the right thing. They understand the seriousness, but they can't really do anything either, just because of the way the system is set up. And at least those are my thoughts on some of the issues around enforcement and so on. And I hope that kind of touched on the question that you intended for me to answer.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Avaneesh, if I may come to you now for your comments on this question, regarding the gaps in effectiveness, and whether penalties are just being seen as a cost of doing business.
Thank you so much, Shirish. In relation to enforcement across the Pacific, there has been a lot of varying degrees of implementation in relation to compliance amongst by the regulators. So I would say at most of the times, what I would say from past experience as well as interacting with the regulators, there is always this lack of ownership by reporting institutions. So as we spoke a bit about earlier, that during the times of the pandemic, it has been very difficult for the regulators and supervisors to actually conduct compliance on-site examinations to the level they would have liked to be able to identify breaches and non-compliance, right? But at the same time, if you were to speak to a reporting institution right now in the Pacific and say that you hadn't done a compliance on-site examination for the past 2 years, and you've just identified data breaches, if you start to find them for non-compliance, that probably wouldn't be the reasonable approach, because you need to give or you should have a consultative dialogue in relation to being able to rectify those deficiencies. But at the same time, how I'm speaking about in terms of lack of ownership is, if you have already undertaken a compliance on-site examination from a regulator perspective, and if there were gaps already in the system, how many institutions in the past 2 years since the pandemic has come about have really gone and looked into those deficiencies and have been proactive in reporting to the regulator that these are the gradual steps that we have taken over time to improve our processes. So at the end of the day, the main thing which I would try to say over here is that there must be certain level of ownership by the board of management, by all levels in the reporting institutions, whereby there is some sort of proactive engagement for them, proactive disclosures to the regulator, those consultative dialogues whereby they're able to keep the regulator updated on checks and balances. The other, I would say another issue would be the legislative deficiencies across Pacific in terms of being able to look at monetary penalties. Some of them do not have these provisions in place. And I understand the stance of the regulators has always been that there would have been non-compliance notices issued. I note that the Fiji FIU has started doing that at this point in time, but they have also set out timelines to the reporting institutions, and there have been constant follow-ups, not to really hit them with a stick, especially during these times, but to have at least that sort of consultative open dialogue approach whereby the institutions are able to explain where there have been breaches and how this has actually been fixed and have this contributed to process improvements over time. So that's my take on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Avaneesh. Okay, let's speak a bit about the prosecution challenges. What are some of the prosecution challenges that regulators and law enforcement agencies face, and also what can reporting entities such as banks, insurance companies, DNFPBs, etc., do better to mitigate some of these challenges? For example, we know that better quality and timely suspicious transaction reports with accurate data, with a well-written ground of suspicion, etc., are very helpful to the financial intelligence unit. But before I ask you to comment on that, let's just run a quick poll question to get the audience view as well. Arpita, can we have the poll, please? Yes. So, audience, if you can participate and give your answers to this poll. In your opinion, which are the areas in the STRs or SARs submitted by your organization which are generally weaker and can be improved upon? And please select just the top two. And while you are answering the poll, let me also remind the audience that if you would like to pose any questions for panelists, please put them in the Q&A window. The Q&A button is at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will take those questions up in a bit. All right, I encourage many more of you to answer the poll. Okay, again, a reminder, please don't post the questions in the chat window. Please put them in the Q&A window. I can see some questions coming in the chat window. It'll be easier for us to answer in sequence if it's in the Q&A window. All right, I think let's stop the poll now. Okay, panelists, you can see the results on your screen. And any comments, Nick, any comments from you on this poll result?
You look, it doesn't surprise me. I think this is exactly the issues that you have, and in the next question session, I'll make some comments about those sorts of things. But no, the findings that are on this panel don't surprise me at all.
Right, Avaneesh, Steve, any comments on the poll result?
I think it's what was anticipated. I would have anticipated that suspicious activity related to ground of suspicion. So wherever the responses has been the higher, those are all interlinked, and that's anticipated. So thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one of the things that a study by the Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Council of STR qualities basically showed these same issues. One of the, I don't want to call it a complaint, but one of the issues that the Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Council had was, they get a report, suspicious transaction report, and they read it, and then they're kind of like, okay, what does this mean? What did the guy actually do? And it's as if the reporting entity is just kind of saying, well, it's off my desk and onto yours now. I don't know, whatever you do with it, I reported it, it's your business now. And instead of looking at it as a cooperative and collaborative effort in actually doing what we're supposed to do. The reason why we report suspicious transactions in the same way as reporting any other, I'll call it criminal activity to the police, is to try to get it stopped. And if we don't provide adequate information on which action can be taken, then it just sits and it clogs up the machinery. So I think we have 500 plus participants. They've correctly, or they've well identified what the issues are, and I hope they can go back to their entities and make sure that any suspicious transaction that's reported will have a good rundown of, for example, the grounds. Just what are the activity indicators that were observed? What do you mean by suspicious activity? And I would also add that perhaps the investigating authorities, such as the Anti-Money Laundering Council and the Central Bank in the Philippine context, and then other countries as well, could do a better job of on their forms that they ask us to file, is to set this kind of thing out. What is suspicious activity, so that the person who is filling it in, especially electronically, can make sure that they are filling in as much information as they can, so that the regulators and investigators can actually do something with it. So that I think the issue can be helped by activity on both sides of what I'll call the line. Thank you.
Shirish, can I make a comment on following on what Steve said? I think I sat in a conference that that Fintelekt organised about 3 years ago, where we had a person that was a former Indian FIU come in and give us a sort of feedback in relation to his investigations that he'd done over 5 years of SCRs. And it scared me what he was actually finding by way of the information that was handed to a regulator, where information was actually wrong, spelling was wrong. It's beyond my imagination that an FIU would send to a regulator that can find them hundreds of millions of dollars documents that aren't true in fact. And it follows then on to the question that we're probably following next about how do you build then trust in law enforcement to work out with what STRs or whatever information has actually got any value without them having to reinvent the wheel and go back and do a full investigation again. That's one of the big problems in this whole process.
Right. And Nick, you have worked with, various regulators around the region. Do you think, are there sort of any common challenges that you see across all regulators, all LEAs? And in the same token, do you also see what direction do they give to their reporting entities to make their own job easier?
Yeah, well, I think that, fundamentally, one of the biggest problems we have with the whole structure, and it was brought in, the thought process, I can understand why it was introduced, but the outcome has been totally different. And that is that there's a significant restriction in relation to the passing of information that's found in an STR. So the problem with the prosecution is that the reporting entities aren't likely or are not inclined to give anything more to the regulator than they actually have to, because they might get caught and be prosecuted for actually releasing information that was part of an STR. Now, we're looking at situations at the moment where you've got 300 million reports, defensive reports and that sort of stuff. Fundamentally, law enforcement's not going to look at more than about 0.00, I think 4 more zeros and then 1, all right, of those documents. So what do we do with all the rest of the stuff? How can we get the regulators to be able to change their mind about suspect matter information tipping off law enforcement, or tipping off organised crime, I should say, or impacting on law enforcement without an issue in relation to all this noise that's going on? So does law enforcement take a little bit more or grab the problem by the throat a little bit more and trust the community, now that we've had this going for nearly 30 years, trust the community to say, look, we are interested in Joe Bananas, Nick Mctaggart. All right, what do you know about Nick Mctaggart? And understand that me as an entity aren't going to go to Nick Mctaggart and say, oh, the coppers are looking at you. Now, it still happens. I saw a report the other day where someone from a financial institution tipped off a particular individual because the law enforcement had sent an order in relation to that stuff. But again, you know, how tight do we make the process to stop that sort of issue without giving us an understanding what's coming with everywhere else? So, you know, my real deal is, if something like that happens, then prosecute the idiot that tipped them off. Do the right thing by it, but don't stop everyone else from talking to each other and reporting all sorts of stuff. Don't stop people like myself as a consultant being able to get information from all these people to say, oh, look, we've got suspicions here. Can you confirm those suspicions for me? Now, they can't tell me what their suspicion was because they've submitted it. If I knew what their submission was, I could say, well, now look, in future, guys, I don't think your STR that you've written will meet the mark. And I've seen hundreds of them. You know, when you look at them and you say, so what? You know, yeah, Nick Mctaggart's a crook. Yeah, I know that. What have you got in relation to your information that's going to take it any further than my understanding already that Nick Mctaggart's a crook? And that's the sort of stuff that we need to be able to continue to do. It's about, why are we reporting? And Steve makes the point, why are we reporting? And what are we trying to achieve by way of the report? Well, the issue should be, we're reporting because we've got something here that we've now analysed and understood that no one else has got. And I want to tell a few people around by way of case study or synthetic intelligence, actionable intelligence, that these are the sorts of things to go in. Don't do defensive reporting. Don't report everything under the sun because you think it's going to be suspicious or whatever. Let's get core work done. Get your analysts focused on the stuff that's making the biggest impact to the institution itself, not all this other noise that's going on, and then report that process and then follow it up either with the regulator or with the law enforcement and say, all right, this is what we've got. This is what we want you to look at. If you've got anything else you want, come back to us and we'll help you out with that, John. And let the law enforcement then go say, well, we notice that half the transactions are with Mr. ABC Bank over B. We're going to get Mr. Bank over B, give us some information as well. And then the three of us are going to communicate. It's happening a little bit with the things like the private practice situations like the Fintel Alliance in Australia. The biggest problem I've got with Fintel Alliance is that due to millions of circumstances, and understand exactly why it is, there's only 15 members. So they get a sort of privileged position in relation to that exchange of actionable intelligence, but the second and third tier punters are still out in the cold. And fundamentally, they're the guys that actually should be in the realm because the big guys have got more money to be able to afford to bring in experts to do their work. So, you know, it's a bit of an issue. We've got to look at the way we're doing business and let's flip it over some way. I haven't got any answers to it, but it needs flipping.
Shirish, can I add a point?
Yes, Steve, go ahead.
Thanks. I want to take off on what Nicholas just said because I think it struck a chord with me as the chief enterprise risk and compliance guy for the company that I work for. I now need you, Nicholas. Thank you. You've given me some free advice on something that I need to do, and I stress that it was free. Please don't bill me for it. That you gave me an idea though of something that I want to do with my own company, and that is I want to try to build into the processing, the review of transactions, how they find STRs, and then what do they do with them, a thinking process. Well, don't just, kind of a fill in the blanks, shoot it off my desk onto yours now, boom, I'm done. Think about this. How can we make this piece, if it fits into a puzzle, how can we make this piece fit better? And what does it mean when I see this? And actually think about it and maybe put some thought into it. Yeah, we have a relatively limited amount of time in which we have to submit the STRs from the time they come to our attention to the time we actually get them onto the regulator's desk. And then there's an approval process and so on. but don't just blindly sign off and ship it on. Try to give some thought. If I were to receive this, could I do something with this? Does this make sense? Does it actually tell me what is going on, or are we just throwing paper around? And avoid, as Nicholas said, avoid the throwing paper around, the defensive things. Try to make all the paper that you submit. And this is something now I'm going to rewrite my policies on trying to make sure that there is put in there some supervisory review and thought. Now, how I document that, I'm not quite sure yet, but that there is a value add to everybody that reviews it that says, okay, this is what we're doing. This is why this is suspicious, and not just because I have, a teller or somebody, a cashier or whatever, saying, oh yeah, this is suspicious. Oh my gosh, oh, look at this. Why? And what are we going to be able to do with this? So thanks, Nicholas. I appreciate that. That's something that I've taken away from this conference already. So I'll make notes on that here in a couple of minutes. Thanks, Shirish.
Thanks, Steve. I think both of you have sort of hit the nail on the head, and I think my takeaway is that it has to be very meaningful. If it's meaningful to you, and it has to be meaningful to the person who's seeing that report, only then it's really going to make a difference. If not, it's almost like garbage in, garbage out, right? So, Avaneesh, do you want to comment on this topic?
No, I mean, I absolutely cannot reiterate. I mean, there's working as a manager intelligence at the Fiji FIU before, we used to sort of grind this into reporting institutions, that the value adding process from the reporting institution right up to the regulator in terms of the whole process, the intelligence value added and otherwise as well, in terms of the ground of suspicion, how well founded that is, and in terms of the FIU actioning, then going back to the reporting institution, that back and forth communication in terms of the whole identifying those missing links and making that STR as prolific as possible is where the intelligence analysts are able to add value, and that is what we have stressed over time. And this has improved reporting as well in terms of online reporting. And when we look at artificial intelligence, the data that gets fed into later, that actually helps the data sets be as accurate as possible. Otherwise, when you have reporting forms which are submitted to the FIUs, which are incomplete, and they haven't taken enough initiative from the reporting institution to really go out and fill out those forms, the timeline as well is sort of saved up on everyone's side, and then the reporting completeness as well on the FIU side is much more better to make more meaning out of the data when it interacts with other data in the artificial intelligence sense within the FIU database. So I think it's a whole complete process, and ownership is where I think it is much more stressed at all levels.
Shirish, can I just make a comment? I am trying to do something about the particular issue. So what I've started to work with is to try and get together what I call detailed case studies, not typologies. Typologies was yesterday's news. No one cares about Bank One and Mr. A and Mr. B and Mr. C. What we've got to do is get case studies in play, and through synthesized information, because the problem we've got with the privacy and all of that sort of issue is that you can't nominate an individual unless you want to make sure that you're fully cleared for liability and all the rest of the stuff. But because of the skills that I put together in relation to writing the typologies, I'm going to start sort of generating what I think some of the banks are starting to do, and some of the institutions. I know Hong Kong does it a fair bit, sending around sort of notices of a particular type of activity that someone can look at. And if they find that that activity is occurring in their institution, they use the STR process to bring it back to an FIU for collection. And because it's sort of linked to the case study by way of a particular reference, it makes life a lot easier for the analyst within the FIU to understand that all this information is about a particular type of typology or a particular type of case, not so much typology. Okay, so
right,
what's your space on that?
Thanks, thanks, Nick. So continuing to speak about, let's say, the regulators, I think if you visit the websites of almost any FIU around the world, you will find that there is always a gap in staffing. They have a budgeted strength, and then they have an allocated strength, which is normally much lower than what is actually budgeted for. So what we find is that regulators are often understaffed, they're often under-resourced. Okay, now how do these challenges in capacity, and capability actually impact enforcement measures, right? There's no easy solution for this, but do you think technology can help overcome some of the issues? But even before we get to that, let me just request Arpita to run the second poll, which is a follow-up on. So this one says, how would you rate the feedback received from the FIU of your country for the STRs or SARs that your organization submits? And maybe if we could tie this in later to the fact that they are fairly understaffed. Okay, so I think right now what is leading is that we receive very little or no feedback, which again will probably not surprise the panelists. There is, however, some light, because some participants have mentioned that there is an adequate and continuous feedback loop. All right, can we have the poll results, please? Okay, so panelists, coming back, maybe you want to comment on this while you answer the next question, that, regulators are often understaffed and under-resourced. How do we overcome these challenges, and can technology help? Combined with that, we know that most people say that there is very little or no feedback coming in. Steve, would you like to go ahead?
I think this touches with one of the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. We had a nice report from the Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Council telling us, well, here's some of the problems that we see. We'd like to see these corrected. But they don't really, when I send in an STR to the Anti-Money Laundering Council, they don't come back and say, okay, well, hey, we really appreciate that, or we've been looking at this. And I can understand that. It kind of, both Avaneesh and Nicholas have talked about this idea of, I'll call it secrecy, so that we don't compromise an ongoing investigation of whether it's terrorists or organized crime people or whatever. But there is something that I think, I don't really like this analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's kind of like when you have a child that's going to school and they're working and they're doing, their homework and all that kind of stuff. They're taking tests and they bring home a test, and the teacher has said, okay, well, you get an A, or, you get a star or whatever. And the parent just kind of says, oh, okay, whatever. When there's no feedback, when there's no, I'm not even saying you have to say thank you, but when there's no feedback, when there's no help, pretty soon you'll lose your enthusiasm for doing stuff. And you have to go by your patriotism or national, whatever it is. That only takes you so far, and then pretty soon you just start going through the motions. I think there is something where a regulator ought to at least acknowledge that they received an STR. And I think that helps a lot also, because that becomes part of the documentation then that the financial institution has, that they can say, well, yeah, we had, when they get audited, yes, we had this many STRs going out, and they were received by the financial intelligence unit. See, we have this feedback loop. But also, especially if they're actually able to contribute to an investigation and a prosecution, where it becomes part of the public record, I think that would be valuable for the FIU and the prosecution service and so on, to say to witnesses in general, but then also to the institution that filed an STR, we appreciate your help on this. This guy was prosecuted, or this group was prosecuted and received X number of, whatever the penalty was. I think that could be something that could be easily done. And I think it would be valuable to be done. The idea of using some kind of software, the AI exists out there. Nicholas talked about earlier receiving tens of thousands of STRs. No human being can actually deal with that many STRs. No group of human beings can do it. It's got to have some kind of AI, or the automated augmented intelligence, that can help look at all of that information and pick out fragments that oftentimes humans don't see. And then go back also. One of the reasons why we have cold case investigations, where cases have been sitting idle for years with homicides, kidnappings, rapes, and so on, is because new information now can go back and add to that old investigation, and we see things in a different light. AI, whether it's automated intelligence, augmented intelligence, or whatever, can help do that. From the government's perspective, that may actually require either some kind of cooperative, maybe some kind of cooperative purchase of software. I'm thinking just off the top of my head right now, maybe APG could actually work with a number of nations, figure out some way to partition information so that, I'm just picking two nations at random. Indonesia doesn't find out what's going on in the Philippines because it's protected, and so on, and vice versa. But they could help with keeping, getting the best software and keeping it up to date. In the Philippine perspective, to use just one nation that I'm familiar with, I think they're going to have to redo the government procurement laws, because as it is now, they do request for information, request for proposals, and by the time they do all that trash, the software is out of date. So it's, there's some serious issues, but I think there's some things that we can do. There is some really good software out there from what I understand. I'm not, and I don't think you want to. Fintelekt isn't in a position to say, well, use this instead of that, but unless they pay you for ads. But you get my point. I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done, that needs to be done to make it a more effective process. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Avaneesh, very quickly, would you like to comment on the resourcing bit within the FIU, especially since you worked with the FIU earlier? What are your thoughts on that? And after that, let's move on to some questions from the audience.
Sure. So just in relation to the feedback that is expected by the reporting entities, there's a few factors to be considered over here. First of all, what level of feedback do the reporting entities want from the FIU? So if you just said STR reference number, reporting reference number, this was disseminated to this particular law enforcement agency on this particular date, and the outcome was not known. So mostly FIUs, what they would do is they would say that STR analyzed, disseminated on this day to this particular law enforcement agency, because end of the day, they don't get that real-time feedback from the law enforcement as well. So that's where the reporting institutions may need to understand that whilst the FIU can only do so much in relation to providing information on what's being analyzed and the proactive disseminations that they've handled, but if they do not get that information from the law enforcement, then they may not be able to provide as comprehensive feedback. So whilst I used to work for the FIU before, what we used to do was, if we had a successful outcome of a case, whereby reporting institution had picked up on a very good grounds of suspicion, and we would actually call the reporting institution and the compliance officer on board together with the law enforcement partner and even the prosecutors to have a morning tea to just celebrate, or even award a certificate, just say, hey, that was a good ground of suspicion. So this kind of encouragement was really, I think, needed. You obviously cannot do it to the level as you would anticipate due to staffing issues, but these are some of the, I think, good ways in which institutions feel acknowledged. At the same time, the feedback loop is maintained, but there have been some institutions who have been very proactive in following up and saying that this case is actually of concern because of perhaps the account has been dormant for a while and it's been reactivated. So what do we do now? So those kind of things whereby institutions proactively reach out to the FIU and say, what's happening with this case? If there's a person with flight risk, there's other indicators. So that's where the FIU can call the law enforcement, give that feedback on a more real-time basis as well. So that's my take on that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Avaneesh. So with that, Avaneesh, Steve, and Nick, thank you so much for joining us today, taking the time and effort to, for sharing your thoughts.
Good. Thank you. It was wonderful to be here. I'm really, really pleased that 500 people showed up to be with us. It's a real opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. See you next time.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So on behalf of Fintelekt and Asian Bankers Association, I also thank all the participants for joining us. I hope you found the webinar useful, and as I said, we will try and get you answers to some of the questions that you raised. Also, a big thanks to Mig Moreno, Ernest Lin, and Amador Henrado at the Asian Bankers Association for galvanizing all the members to this webinar today. As I mentioned when we started, this webinar actually marks the 3rd year anniversary of the Fintelekt AB webinars. This is the 21st webinar that we've managed to organize, and it's great that so many of you have continued attending them. So thanks again to ABA for that as well. With that, let's bring this webinar to an end, and have a great day, and have a great week ahead. Bye for now.